Good afternoon. My name is Yvonne Ortiz. I am the Training and Education Specialist at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to our webinar session titled Preventing Compassion Fatigue and Honoring Thyself. First, I would like to acknowledge the sadness that we're all feeling today about this week's events. And the impact of these horrific events are felt in our place of employment, of course, are felt in our communities, and weigh heavily on all of our hearts and minds. As our colleagues from Move Over Violence wrote, these tragedies are reminders of the interconnectedness of violence and oppression, all fueled by hate and domination, and serve as yet another urgent call for us to center the most impacted and work across sectors as we look for solutions to end violence for all. But before we can do that, we need to take care of each other. We need to take care of ourselves. We must recognize the importance of taking care of ourselves. Today's webinar is our first step in doing that. So help me, everyone, welcoming our amazing presenter today. Her name, as you know, is Santa Molina-Marshal. Santa is a licensed clinical holistic psychotherapist who has been working in the field of trauma and sexual violence for 30 years. In April 2014, she was awarded the National Sexual Violence Resource Center 2014 Visionary Voice Award for her outstanding work in the field of anti-sexual violence within her community. For the last 8 years, she held the position of Director of Counseling and Advocacy at the D.C. Rape Crisis Center, where she directed the center's counseling program, provided individual and group counseling, and supervised all clinical staff and graduate social work students. Between March 2013 and January 2014, Santa also served as interim director and was officer over all the programs and departments. She directed all policies, grants, management, and board-related functions. Since February 2014, she has been managing her full-time private practice in Washington, D.C., providing client-focused therapy services in English and Spanish, and is a national and international speaker on women, trauma, mindfulness, grief and loss, compassion fatigue, neurobiology of trauma, and other topics. Santa, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
The pleasure is mine, Yvonne, and I, too, come to you all not with a heavy heart, but with much gratitude for the work that we do as advocates in the field of anti-violence. I think that Yvonne presented it as best as anyone else could have. In order for us to do the work that we do and to continue to do that, it is imperative that we take care of ourselves. And so I think that it is a gift that this webinar was scheduled for today without us, of course, ever anticipating the incredible events of this last week, but being reminded that this is what we are facing somewhere in our world every day. It's the level of oppression, control, domination, and pure insensitivity and disrespect for humankind. And so I commend you for taking time on a Friday afternoon to be here. And I hope that you leave feeling fueled and inspired. So thank you again to the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence for scheduling this time. So let us begin on preventing compassion fatigue and honoring thyself. Compassion fatigue is the #1 epidemic in the caregiving field, and it is the #1 epidemic specifically, and we'll hear more about this, but specifically because there is so much that we do beyond the caregiving in the particular field. And I believe that you can all identify with the many ways in which you are a caregiver the many people that you take care of outside of your work. Outside of your work, how many of you are taking care of children, parents, family members, pets? How many of you are taking care of your lovers, your girlfriend, your boyfriend? How many of you, because of the field that you're in, people just know, go to Santa. Santa will know. Santa will have an answer or a resource or may know somebody. So again, it is the number one epidemic in the caregiving field because caregivers are not just doing a job. It is who we are. We care, and we give, and we give, and we give. So there is this caregiving personality that also is compounding the risk of us ending up with compassion fatigue, and that is that trauma teaches us how to be empathic. And in order for you to be empathic, you have to open yourself up. Open yourself up to experiencing what the other person is experiencing. I don't know, and I may be aging myself, I don't know if the young people still say things like, are you feeling me? And what they mean by that is literal. Are you feeling me? Do you feel what I feel? Are you getting me? Are you getting what I get in my experience? So the caregiving personality requires us to feel the people that we come in contact with, the clients that we're working with, that we're advocating with, that we're counseling, that we are speaking to. It requires us to feel. And so the same set of skills, personality, tools, energy that is required to be able to do the work that we do, which is empathy, is doing the same thing that really puts us at risk. And that is because when we open ourselves up to feel one another, you're opening yourself up to experiencing what that other person has experienced. You have become a secondary to the traumatic event. And so that same experience of being overwhelmed, the same as the slide says, that freezing cold fear that our clients experience, we experience. And so compounded with that is the crisis of caregiving. It is a direct exposure to our level of taking care of others that unfortunately puts us in this situation. And so it is essential that we take care of ourselves as a result of that. I like saying that if we were mine workers, M-I-N-E, mine workers, we would probably go in with some armor to rescue someone in a mine. We would probably have rescue teams right outside, not only for those that were rescued, but for those who were doing the rescuing if it were necessary. And so that is the attitude that we need to have. We need to remember at all times that we are exposing ourselves. And as much as we open our heart and go in there and take care of those, we must remember to take care of ourselves before, during, and after the event that we have gone into address. Now, the good news is that compassion fatigue, and some people call it compassionate stress or secondary traumatic stress, is natural, it's predictable, but it's also treatable and preventable. It is not just a consequence of working with people that are suffering and there's nothing we can do. It just requires us to be mindful, to take an additional step. So I'd like to ask you, those of you who are listening, to take a moment and really think about how many roles of caretaking, caregiving do you have? Do you have 1, 2, 3? How many hours of your day do you spend taking care of others? And this is an invitation to literally be seen, to see yourself. Just think about it. Also, I want to invite you to take a moment to think about the fabric of your own experience. Because the other thing that we are faced with is that as advocates and caretakers, caregivers in this field, we come to our work with our own experiences, our own thread, our own fabric, our own history. I mean, let's just take what we have all experienced to some degree just in this past week. So again, I want to ask you to take a moment and let yourself be seen. If nothing else, see yourself in this moment. Take a moment to think about your own history. If you're a person of color, you come with some threat of oppression, of prejudice, of abuse, of neglect. And that's not to say that only people of color have that experience, but we all have that experience to some degree. So what is your own history with trauma? You need to be aware of what impacts you when you're out there doing your work. What impacts you? What affects you? What are things that you just cannot tolerate? What are some of the experiences that you deal with that hit at the core? I know in my work there are plenty of times when my eyes get moist, or when I need to refrain from responding from a place of my personal experience and remember that I'm there to serve someone else, and they may not have the same reaction that I may be having. So what impacts you? And I invite you to use our communications chat to maybe share some of that if you feel comfortable, just 1 or 2 words. One of the other things that unfortunately puts us at risk is that somehow there is a narrative that we should not, as professionals, be impacted.
Santa, I think we have some responses. I'm going to ask Casey.
Santa, thank you so much for asking these important questions. First, when you asked participants how many hours of your day do you spend taking care of others, and just to consider that, a common response was 8 to 10 hours is what some of the participants are offering. In response to your question about, what really cuts you to your core, one participant, Becca, says, as an educator, devil's advocates cut me to my core. Sam says, denial of others' trauma. Cassandra says, I work with children and it really triggers me when they do not act like I expect them to. I have to really stop and take a breath to be able to effectively work with the children that are impacted by trauma. Cynthia says stories about animals getting killed always gets to her. Ashley says clients that have an excuse for every option that you give to them. Others are welcome to share.
And that's what's important here, right? It is important for us to be aware of what triggers us, what comes up for us, what are things that we are intolerable to. We come with our own array of prejudice and our own intolerance and our own experiences that make it challenging for us to feel each other.
Santa, we've got some other responses. Karen says the sadness that the cops in Dallas were targeted. Of course, I think we're all sitting with that sadness today. Melissa has an interesting one. Working with clients who abuse their children, I think, can be particularly difficult. Josie says working with people with mental health who are not taking their medication. Joe says anything with kids just really gets to him.
So it sounds like part of what I'm hearing is that it is really challenging sometimes to work with those who either may need the help but are not ready for it. Those who may need the help but are not empowered enough to receive it. Right? And so those aspects of our work are important for us to be aware of and to be able to talk about them, as I started to say earlier, to be able to talk about them so that we're not holding these experiences, these ideas, and thinking that they're isolated to only us, that we can start getting support from each other, so that we can start getting ideas from each other, so that we can start taking breaks and saying, I cannot work with one more child who was assaulted today. Can someone else take that call, that space? So it is important for us to be able to honor that. And again, I don't know how many administrators, managers, directors are on the call, but as administrators, doctors, directors, it is our responsibility to assist and to create spaces where our staff can begin to feel that it is okay for them to say, that was a really hard session or intervention, to come back to the office or run to somebody's office and say, I need a moment. Do you have a moment? And to make space for that and to make time for it. And of course it's challenging giving our grants and giving the amount of work that we all need to do. It is extremely challenging. But deepening your awareness, allowing yourself to see yourself, and allowing others to see you is imperative. So let us move on then to another very critical piece here. A lot of people talk about the fact that there is thinking that takes place in memory and ways in which we remember the experiences that we've had throughout our day. But one of the things that we often forget is that our bodies also experience everything that we experience throughout the day. So our body is our second brain. In our bodies, we hold every experience we've ever had, good, bad, or indifferent. It is the unconscious mind where all of the emotions are stored, and particularly the emotions that are overwhelming. They're waiting to de-escalate. An emotion that's overwhelming is an escalation in your body and your nervous system, and those emotions are held there until they have the opportunity to de-escalate. And so it's also really important not just to note what's happening in your thoughts or your experiences, but also to note what's happening in your body. How are you feeling in terms of your body? Not just the thoughts, not just the emotional aspect, but what about the aches and pains, the back pains, the migraine headache, the tummy ache? Those are all experiences that the body is holding, saying, I am overwhelmed. Something is overwhelming. And so I just want you to hold these thoughts. And I promise you that I'm going to stop talking about the threat and the fear. But it is important for you to know why compassion fatigue is such an epidemic and so serious. So stress, and there are different types of stress, right? There's the stress that is ordinary, the stress of, I think I lost my car keys, or, oh my God, I don't know where my favorite purse is, or, whatever, small, I forgot my lunch. Those are small stressors, and they can be other things that are just as significant. And then we have challenge. And challenges may be more like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to pay mortgage this month, or fix my car, or my child is ill, or the threat of grants being slashed, or things of that nature. Stressors can also be even greater than that. the stressors that are like the experiences that so many people had last week, the stressors that people have been having throughout centuries, the stressors that our clients have when they're assaulted, when they feel totally disempowered, right? And those are called trauma ruptures. And so we have ordinary stressors, challenges, and trauma ruptures. The situation that's critical about understanding the impact of stress is that stress most often becomes most critical depending on how one perceives it. So I made some comments of what are stressors, what are challenges, and what are traumatic ruptures. But those experiences are very individual. So what may be just a typical stress for me may be a challenge for you. What may have been a challenge for you may be a trauma rupture for somebody else. Because our body holds every experience that we've had, how we respond to stress is directly proportionate to the experiences we have had. So someone who is constantly challenged and under stress comes already with a nervous system that's activated, with a nervous system that has already been processing stressful information. So again, the concern is that we are constantly picking up experiences of stress. And so our clients and us, because we are no different when it comes to this, have experienced terrorism, street violence, natural disasters, accidents of all sorts, some physical, sexual abuse, domestic violence, the hysterical experience of just being overwhelmed. And then there's also the historical trauma. And so again, my perception and my experience and how I process stress is very individual to who I am, where I've been, what I get exposed to. The other thing that's critical in terms of processing stress is how quickly do I get help? So again, that question of, do you have someone that you can run to and say, my God, I was just so overwhelmed on that call, on that session, on that intervention? Because how quickly you're able to process whatever your degree of stress is going to determine your perception of that being a threat. And it's a threat in your body and your nervous system. You may not be thinking, oh, that call was so challenging, that threatened me. It's not necessarily how we process it. But the body that was holding, the muscles tight, the breath, in, the body that was twitching, the body that had an accelerating heart, is still processing that. So again, stress equals your own personal perception of how threatening is that experience that you just had. So I want to open the floor again and just hear some comments of, does anybody know what I'm talking about in relation to how your body responds to stress? How your body responds to challenge or even traumatic ruptures when you are experiencing it firsthand or when you are simply, not that it's simple at all, witnessing, facilitating, lending your voice to your clients and to survivors. So the floor is open for some comments if there are folks who want to share. Again, letting yourself be seen.
So yes, it looks like people are sharing. Paula notices elevated blood pressure. I know for me personally, it's upset stomach. Mandy says she gets tight muscles and knots in her stomach. Martha loses her appetite. Tori said it sometimes comes in the form of physical illness. I know it can sometimes break down your immune system. Cassandra says when she's faced with a stressful experience, she can physically feel her heart race and her leg twitching. Brenda says she finds it hard to go to work to see clients this morning after reading all the news from the past few days. Feels like she's reached her threshold of terrible news. Brandy's weakened immune system. Becca gets nauseous or dizzy and sweaty. Christina says her physical symptoms are tight, achy shoulders, migraines, knots in the stomach, insomnia. Melissa describes shoulder and neck pain. Becca describes that too. Also feeling high-strung and unable to relax. Megan talks about butterflies and feeling like there's a spotlight on her. Carla talks about jaw clenching. That seems to be a common one too. And pain. Also headaches. Jossie says she feels like crying. I'm seeing a theme of muscle soreness, tightening muscles. Sam says, my mind gets really separated from my body because I need to keep my thoughts separate from the sinking feeling in his or her body. Ashley said, just tired, exhaustion all the time. Those are some of the themes that we're seeing over here in the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you all for sharing that and for allowing yourself again to be seen. And I commend you for your awareness. So the key to preventing compassion fatigue, and I'm going to talk just a little bit more about what is compassion fatigue, but the key to preventing it is particularly awareness, the mindfulness, your awareness, your ability to note what is happening for you. Yeah? So people often think that...
Santa, I wonder if I can interrupt you. Karen's asking if you can define trauma rupture again for all of us.
Absolutely, absolutely. So trauma rupture, I was explaining that there's stressors, then there's challenges, and then there are trauma ruptures. So the trauma ruptures are the experiences that render you incapable of managing the situation. It is an experience where you have reached your threshold and the stress or challenge has gone beyond your capacity to tolerate. And again, part of what I explained is that that is really undefiable, meaning that we cannot really explain or predict or even define, because it's so personal depending on what your experiences have been. So a trauma rupture is a time when your barrier, your ability to protect yourself, your ability to assert yourself, your ability to empower yourself is gone. There is no barrier. The barrier has been blown away. Thus, you are experiencing a trauma rupture. I hope that helps, and thank you for the question. So going back to what people think often, when they think of compassion fatigue, they think of burnout. And burnout is something very different than compassion fatigue. Burnout is a process in which you believe that you will never be able to do whatever is required of you. It's a physical thing. If there being more demand than there is ability or supply. It's you being overworked. It's you being required to do something you don't have the skills for. It's you, over time, accumulating a sense that no matter what, you cannot do enough, give enough. You are not eventually able to have the capacity. So that's burnout, and we do see that also in our field. We see a lot of burnout, folks who are just never able to feel rewarded for their work or like they've achieved and can complete things because there's so much to do. So that's burnout. You add to that what I talked about earlier, which is secondary trauma stress, or what we know in a diagnostic clinical way, post-traumatic stress. You add to burnout the experience of A, being witness to events that rupture your trauma vortex, that break through. You experience that, and you have the repetitive aspect. Right? So what I'm saying is that through that feeling that you don't have enough time to do your work, that you don't have enough skills, that you just don't have the capacity, that somehow it's never enough, you add to that the witnessing of traumatic events that rupture your barrier to tolerate, and you keep having that over and over again. And folks, what that is, it's the definition, the clinical definition of what PTSD is, post-traumatic stress disorder, is two of the major criteria is that there's an event that renders you feeling incapable, whether you're witnessing it or experiencing it. It's a threat of death. It's a threat of not being able to go on. And that's what happens in trauma rupture. The other major criteria of PTSD is the intrusive thoughts. Now, how many times, are we in our car on our way home, and without necessarily wanting to, we're thinking about a client we saw or a situation that came up, right? How many times are you at the dinner table with your family, and all of a sudden a thought pops up? Now, I'm not talking about when you deliberately decide to bring work home. That's something different. I'm talking about the intrusion, the times you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about a situation, a story, an event, wondering about how a client made it. That's what I'm referring to here.
Santa, I wonder if I can pose a question that's coming up here. And I'm not sure there is a difference. Is there a difference between vicarious trauma and secondary trauma, or do those terms refer to the same concept?
Those terms are referring to the same concept. It is referring to you being the witness of traumatic events. So right now, we probably, and this is a huge generalization, but we probably are all walking around a tremendous amount of vicarious and secondary trauma because we witness consistently traumatic events. The things that happen in the world, again, the body is receiving them.
And
so once again, yes.
I'm sorry. No, that was very helpful response. Another question that came up, and I'm not sure if you're planning to address it, but participants are wondering how to rise above or respond to these trauma ruptures. Will you be giving, some concrete strategies for us during this webinar?
We are about to shift gears.
Okay.
We're about to shift gears. Absolutely, absolutely. It is, however, I just want to make sure that we're clear about the seriousness and the importance of us taking care of ourselves. So that's why I spend so much time at first talking about how critical it is and how dangerous and how vulnerable we are as advocates and as counselors and so on and so forth. So remember that compassion fatigue is a secondary traumatization or the vicarious trauma plus the burnout, both of which we experience in our field, often simultaneously. So I'm going to go through these slides rather quickly. and just ask you as I go through them to identify yourself. So there are really no stages of compassion fatigue, but there are different phases. And the reason why I distinguish stages from phases is because we go in and out. I may be, in the face of feeling like a zombie, and then all of a sudden I'm feeling excited and be back in that jealousy place or irritable place, and we go in and out. But it's important for you to at least identify where you are and when you're there. So as these slides are going on, I just want you to see how you identify yourself. So here we go. This is usually the first phase, something to be aware of. You're idealistic. You overcommit yourself. You're ready to solve every problem. You have time for everything. You're very excited. You go the extra mile. And sometimes that is celebrated because that means you're a really, really good and dedicated advocate. Pay attention to that and notice if you can identify with that. The irritability phase. Usually that phase when you begin to feel you're tired and you're irritable and you're discontent. And you begin to cut corners in your work. You want to avoid contact with clients. You are happy when clients cancel, when they don't show up, when they come late because it's like a break. You begin to really even make light of your clients or the colleagues. You use humor to not necessarily to release tension, but to avoid. You daydream, you make mistakes, and a very telling piece is that you begin to isolate yourself from family, from friends. You're tired. You want to come home and just never talk to anyone for the rest of the night. Just be aware. Are you in that state? Or the withdrawal phase, where you begin to feel that the work is never ending and we're not going to ever make a difference. You're losing the enthusiasm to do your work. You group people together. It's all those women who just keep getting beaten up, and you tell them what to do and they just keep going back, or these adolescents that just, they don't hear, they don't. So we start grouping people together, or maybe it's a racial group. We complain about our work, and we just feel, again, like it's best to stay to ourselves. We feel tired, and we begin to, once again, create those walls. And be careful about the ways in which we create walls, because we know that there's all kinds of ways of avoiding. And oftentimes, when we're in this withdrawal phase, we're creating walls in very dysfunctional ways. And then usually the last phase, and again, remember I said these were phases, but not necessarily stages, so you can go in and out of these. But the last phase is that sense of hopelessness, anger, sometimes even rage. You begin to feel that others are incompetent, or you yourself have become incompetent. You have no patience. That's it. You have nothing else to give. That slide that was shown much earlier, where I said that you open yourself up in order to be a caretaker. You have to open yourself up to feel each other. Well, you have nothing else to feel with. You're done. And here are some of the symptoms of compassion fatigue. Some of the things that you all talked about when you chatted, when you shared. There's the physical, just feeling tired, keyed up, nervous, psychological, pessimism, feeling like you don't know anything, being cynical, angry, depressed, or the emotional. The spiritual, if you're a spiritual person, you start to feel really distrustful, isolated, like there's no hope, no time. And then the professional, which is all about the lack of productivity and losing interest in your work. You have an opportunity, and we're not necessarily going to do this right now, But you have an opportunity here you have a handout that's been provided to you to measure your symptoms of compassion fatigue, to really begin to track where are you along these spaces, what symptoms are you having. And I say we're not necessarily going to go over this right now together because a lot of you gave great feedback in terms of what you were feeling in your body earlier. But I do want to ask again, what phases come to your mind? Where have you been? Where are you now? Where do you see your colleagues? If you would share those.
It looks like Marjorie is sharing that she's in zombie phase most of the time. Cassandra says she can see herself falling into the irritability phase. Others are quiet, I think, contemplating. Sam says definitely irritability. Tori says she can see a lot of the irritability phase in her colleagues and herself.
Yeah.
Christy wonders, is it possible to be in all stages at once?
Absolutely. It is possible in one day to navigate through all of those stages and to go back and forth. And again, what's important is to be aware of them, right? To be really aware of them. So here's the good news, folks. Compassion fatigue, we can do something about that. We can be intentional or we can be reactive. And of course, you already know what the reactivity looks like, right? But the intentional part is to have mission and purpose, is to be aware of your own internal locus of control, of what's happening for you, to develop some self-regulatory skills and tools, which we're going to talk about in a moment, to minimize your stress, take care of your health, right? And so to pay attention and remember that the body is experiencing everything, good, bad, or indifferent. So how many of you have spent hours and hours and hours in this last week following it from social media, the details of everything that's going on just in this country, never mind in others, right? How many of you come home and listen to the news? How many of you, just are in constant communication with your friends and your families and colleagues about stressful things? How many of you watch really violent movies or programs or novelas, right? So again, being aware of minimizing the input, because remember, there's stress, there's challenge, and then there's rupture. There's the traumatic trauma rupture.
Santa, before you move on, and I know we're all really curious to talk about the next, what we can do about it stuff, but Josie's wondering if you can define one of the terms on the last slide. It was parasympathetic dominance.
Thank you. Yes, the parasympathetic dominance. There's parasympathetic and then there's sympathetic. So let me say a little bit something about sympathetic dominance first. Sympathetic dominance are the things that were shared when I asked how's the body feeling. The sympathetic dominance is the response of the nervous system to a traumatic event. It's the threat response. It's the tension in your body. It's the way in which your pupils get dilated and your eyes get big. It's the way in which you tense your shoulders. It's the way in which the nervous system tells the body, there is a threat and let's prepare to fight, flee, or freeze because there's nothing we can do. And those are normal neurological responses to threat. The parasympathetic dominance, so that's what's called dysregulation. If you look on the side of reactivity, what I just described is the dysregulation in the body, in the nervous system. The parasympathetic dominance is that aspect of us that can relax. Can you take a deep breath? Can you intentionally loosen your muscle? Can you relax your pulse, your heart rate? Can you notice when that is happening? And again, in the second half of my talk, we're getting ready right now to move into, so how do you do that? But that's what the parasympathetic dominance is, being in that state where you're not feeling threatened or responding to threat. And of course, if the threat is real, then you want to respond with that dysregulated, activated nervous system of fight, flight, freeze. The problem is that there's not always a threat, but we perceive it because we're being triggered or we're so overexposed. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
So let's begin to talk about self-care and things that we can do to really honor ourselves and the work that we do so that we can continue to be compassionate and continue to feel each other, experience each other for a very, very long time. Because, folks, we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. And so we must stay clear, motivated, healthy so that we can do this work. So I have here just a couple of possibilities of things that one can do. And I just want to check. See, I'm sorry, here we go. So I just want to check with you all, honoring your ancestors. When you do this work, do you assume that you're doing this work by yourself? Or do you assume that you're doing this work as a continuum of the work that started, that someone else has started? Do you remember that you're not alone? Do you remember that there are millions of us out here advocating, fighting, supporting, encouraging? So honoring your ancestors